Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Preparing for Human Subjects Research workshop. I'm Daria Orlowska. I'm the data librarian here at Waldo Library. And with me is Julia. Julia, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Julia Mays. I'm the Associate Director for Research Compliance. I oversee human subject animals used in teaching, testing, and research, and recombinant synthetic DNA. I am the backup for export control and any training with regards to research compliance. I either am the chief administrator or actually provide the training myself. So welcome.
Yes, welcome. And Julia and I were talking, and we decided that there isn't one place for this information in terms of if you're trying to prepare for human subjects research. And so we thought we'd put on a workshop to kind of give you an introduction of when you're getting started, what you should look out for. And even if you've been doing this for a bit, hopefully there's something in here that you might take away from the workshop. But it's really intended for especially students who are starting off with their theses or dissertations just to know what to look out for.
So I
So,
do have a question for you, Daria.
yeah,
Would you prefer that they ask questions as we go or wait to some point?
you can ask questions in the chat as we go. If we see them, we will address them. I will try my best to pause and take questions. But if you want to hold them till the end, that's fine as well. We will stick around, Julia and I, and answer any questions you may have or chat at the end of this workshop. So yeah, just to get started, so by the end of this workshop, hopefully you will know if you are conducting human subjects research and if this workshop applies to you. We'll go over some of the basics there. You will gain an understanding of research setup steps, just what are things that you should look out for, what are some basics, and then identify strategies for efficient study data management. So a little bit from Julia's world about things on her side in the Office of Research and Innovation, and then a little bit on my side, which is helping individuals manage their research studies more effectively. Okay, so we're going to go right into it. The first bit is just the initial setup of the study. So the first things first is really understanding what human subjects research is. So, human subjects research is when you have living individuals about whom an investigator is conducting research, and they are either obtaining some sort of information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction, or is obtaining or using or analyzing identifiable private information, or if the study is generating that kind of information. So this is really what human subjects research is on this campus. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Julia, about how things have changed recently in terms of what we call human subjects research.
So I just want to mention when we look at something, it is those projects that appear to touch humans. And I say that because journals, most journals, if a project appears to touch humans, they want to know that an IRB looked at it and made a determination. So if you have a project and you're not certain, you can always reach out to me, send me an email with a summary of what you're doing, and I will take a look at it. What we first decide is this research? We apply a federal definition. Is it generalizable knowledge, or are you transferring generalizable knowledge? And if you meet that threshold, then we determine, is this human subject research? And at Western, because the Office of Human Research Protection, which is the federal office that oversees 45 CFR 46, often referred to as a common rule, are the regulations that we apply. And they've allowed the institution to make the determination on how the regulations are going to be applied. And it's most important with exempt studies, because if you Google exempt, you will find that they're exempt from 45 CFR 46. But again, the organization makes that determination. And at Western, we require an IRB review and approval to conduct exempt studies. Please note that exempt doesn't mean that it's free from regulations. And one of the categories of review is expedited. And note that that does not mean fast.
Yes. And to kind of piggyback off of that is our next slide is, do I need IRB approval? And like Julia said, that if you're not sure, you can always email her and provide a study description. But here are some general guidelines to kind of get you started thinking about this. So if you are using anonymized or aggregated data, a lot of the times that's secondary research data that you might have not gathered, or if you didn't participate in data collection or you can't re-identify the individuals, um, then you may not or you may need IRB approval. Some journals, like Julia said, might want to see IRB review when you're submitting articles, so that's a consideration to keep in mind. And if you are a student conducting your honors thesis, your master's thesis, or your dissertation, you're probably going to want to seek out IRB approval anyway because it's required by our institution to that your study has been looked at by the IRB and they make that determination. So if you're not sure and you're using these categories, it's best to reach out. If you are using a data set that requires a subscription password or permission for access, or human subjects data that has not been de-identified, you might have not collected it, but maybe you're in a lab that has some data that hasn't been de-identified, then you're probably going to need IRB review. So, and it depends on your study and how much personal or information you have that you're dealing with or sensitive information that you're dealing with, but your study might be expedited or exempt. I see a question. Yes, you will be forwarded a link for this recorded workshop and it will be on the library YouTube page. So don't worry there. You'll have access to this. But yeah, a lot of the times when data sets are behind a paywall or password protected, a lot of the times that might mean they may contain identifiers. There's certain restrictions for reusing them. And in that case, the IRB should really get involved to look at this data and make a determination of how your research should be reviewed.
Let me just
And
add to, excuse me, if you are using a data set that requires a data use agreement, that needs to come to ORI. The VP for ORI is the one that would sign that data use agreement. And often, if there's an agreement in place, it requires the IRB. Sometimes it's written right in the agreement that they want the IRB to provide oversight for that data use.
yes, and if you are collecting new human subjects data, then you definitely need to go to the IRB and be like, I'm collecting new research. And your study may either fall under exempt, expedited, or full, depending on how sensitive the information is. There are some links for a decision tree for two different organizations if you want to take a look at those to get you started. But as Julia mentioned, project summaries can be emailed to her directly or to this email address at the bottom, wmu-irb@wmich.edu, if you need a second opinion or if you're not really sure how to get started. One of the first things that you're going to do once you decide, yes, I have human subjects data that I'm going to either be reusing or collecting is you're going to want to get some training. CITI Training is what most institutions, I think, use, the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, which is just a place where there's courses on social and behavioral sciences research. that consist for us of 13 modules that take a few hours to complete. This really trains you on some data ethics and research ethics and some good practices to keep in mind as a researcher who, wants to make sure that they're conducting everything in line with what has been established by the federal government and um, to make you aware of the history of research and conduct. So after you complete your training, you save your certificate for yourself for your own records. But if you put your primary email address as your WMU email, it will be automatically loaded into Cayuse, and then Julia can go in and make sure that you've actually completed this training. And this training is required when you are submitting a new proposal, so make sure that you put aside enough time to get it done, because it does take a little bit of time when you're completing it the first time around. The course is good for 3 years, after which you can take a short refresher to maintain the ability to conduct human subjects research. And I mentioned briefly Cayuse. Cayuse is our electronic research administration platform for use on our campus to submit research proposals and also to receive approval. This is just your centralized go-to place. If you have anything that you're doing with human subjects research, you'll want to go here. Just a note that students aren't automatically enrolled in Cayuse. They need to request access. Access is requested through contacting Julia. You can contact her through her web form, or if you have her email address, you could do that as well. Um, and when you are doing your degree-driven projects as a student, if you're listed as a primary contact, you will receive access to study updates within Cayuse. If you don't do that, you won't receive those emails. And especially if you're the person who is conducting all the research and filing everything into Cayuse, that's something that you will want to have on hand, and you will want those reminders. Um, so in order to get to this platform, there are links within the Office of Research and Innovation to get here. When you get access to this PowerPoint presentation, this is also hyperlinked to get you there. But to get to this page, you would go down, you would use this drop-down menu to go into human ethics, and it will bring up this dashboard, and you would create a new study in order to uh, get started with a new proposal. And you would run through a series of free response and multiple choice boxes to complete everything. And just a note that if you are a student, make sure that you're actually putting yourself as a student and not a co-investigator. Anything I missed, Julia?
It's by WMU policy for human subject research, students are listed as student investigators. They do not qualify as the principal investigator. And so when you are filling out this, important for primary contacts to list yourself if this is a degree-driven project and the PI as primary contacts. In addition to what Daria mentioned, it allows you to submit modifications, renewals, incident reports, and when you're ready to submit a final report, it allows you to close it. One thing that I find that is a common question for Cayuse, everything in Cayuse is considered a submission once you create that study. So an initial submission would be when you first start this study. If you're making a modification, a renewal, incident closure, they're all considered submissions. So just keep that in mind. And if you have a question about it, you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly.
Yeah, and there is a link at the bottom of the slide for some instructions for submitting an IRB application on Cayuse that links to something that the Office of Research and Innovation has put together that you can use as a guide. And I'm sure there's been a number of workshops on Cayuse that have been recorded as well that should be available through the website. I think I saw at least one. So if you have any questions, Julia is your go-to person for that. So when you're in Cayuse, you're going to be submitting your IRB application for the first time, and these are just kind of the categories that you'll be putting information about. So you'll have to have your CITI training before you begin, because that is going directly into the system and is a requirement in order for you to even start conducting the research. Then you'll have some basic study information, so things about like what is the study title, what is the basic summary. Then you'll have information about your targeted participant pool. So what are their demographics? What are your target numbers? Like how many participants are you hoping to recruit within your study? Then you'll have some free response areas for your study design. In and like so purpose, inclusion, exclusion, and consent form, as well as the type of review that needs to be conducted for your project. And you have here on the right-hand side the three categories. So you have exempt, expedited, and full. And you can think of it as exempt is less than a minimal risk. And as your risk goes up, so usually if you're collecting sensitive information or you're dealing with a population that is protected. If you go through CITI training, it will talk a little bit about protected populations such as prisoners, children, individuals who might have a specific disease. There's a number of categories there, so that training will help you. But as you go up in sensitive information and sensitive populations, your risk also goes up. And then you have did you want to say something, Julia?
I was just going to mention that at a university, uh, students are considered a protected population. Doesn't necessarily increase the risk of the study. The concern is because students have multiple relationships with the university, their college, their department, their colleagues, their professors. We want to make sure that uh, coercion and undue influence is minimized. Uh, in addition, when you're in Cayuse and you look at these categories, if you look over to the right, there are black question marks. And if you hover over them, they'll give you a better understanding of each of those categories based on the regulations.
Yeah. And there are some suggestions as well. It I know that like in addition to those question marks, there's some additional information sometimes below the actual question that will give you a sense of what you should be filling out. Um, So yeah, so study procedures as well, and I highlighted future use of data because that is my area. So um, it is good to know whether you have a grant or you might want to be submitting to a journal that requires that you make your data publicly available. Because if you are planning on doing that, you need to write that into your consent form. You need to put it into your proposal. So that's just something to keep in mind because sometimes people forget that you need to have your participants consent to that before you can do it. And again, there is an initial Cayuse submission document guide for reference to help guide you through these steps, in addition to the built-in help within Cayuse that Julia mentioned. Okay, so now we're kind of going into the nitty-gritty. One of the things that you are going to need to put into your proposal is completed consent forms. And depending on how you're conducting your study, it might look a little different. So this is an example of an online consent form through Qualtrics. Qualtrics is our go-to platform for doing surveys at the university. So you should be able to log in and get started there. I just wanted to mention that you'll have like an abbreviated version of the consent form within the beginning body of Qualtrics, but it does include all these components. So you make sure you're following that and including all that information. And then when you are actually asking individuals for consent within an online survey, you'll want to set up a multiple choice forced response um, question, in which case, if they do not agree, it kicks them out and it thanks them for considering um, participating, but doesn't then you have no more engagement with those individuals. And only if they agree are they presented with the following questions. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're using Qualtrics, that you have a number of these options on the left-hand menu. Um, and be sure to check them out in terms of like when you need to force responses versus request a response, which just prompts individuals that they might have missed a question. And if you want any sort of validation or any sort of logic. So this is actually a logic here when you're asking if they want to consent to the research. You're using logic to determine whether or not it ends the survey or it brings up the next question. Um, I will also say that if you have any inclusion criteria or exclusion criteria that you want to present to individuals taking your survey, um, it's also good maybe to set it up at the very beginning and to have a forced response. And that doesn't allow individuals to see the subsequent questions until they filled out those questions.
So keep in mind that from an IRB and regulatory standpoint, when you are doing Qualtrics or any SurveyMonkey, the very first thing that an individual should see once they review your recruitment and they're interested in learning more and they click a link that takes them to Qualtrics, the very first thing they should see is the consent document. And under the changes to the common rule, the study summary, which you see in this example, is a concise summary covering multiple areas that the regulations now require, so that a reasonable person can review that graph and make a determination if they want to go any further. In addition, the other thing that is, and that's in that second line after the first paragraph, the future use of data. Those were two elements that were added when the common rule was revised and implemented in 2019.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were talking about. If you want to share your data later on, you need to have a statement that individuals agree with. In this case, the default is that de-identified anonymous information collected for this research may be used by or distributed to investigators for other research without obtaining informed consent from you. If that is not the case for your research study, it can be changed to it will not be shared. If you find that your study is one where you're collecting information that can't be shared to the public because it can't be de-identified enough and it poses an additional risk. Um, yeah, another thing, it's already in here, but I'm gonna highlight it, is make sure that you put how much time it's actually gonna take individuals to complete your survey. That is also important information for people sitting down to know how much time they need to allocate to it. Okay, I will keep moving. There is an example of an online informed consent document as well on the Office of Research and Innovation page.
And just so that you're aware, we have several templates on our web page. We want you to use those. We don't want to diminish creativity, but if you create your own, we will point you back to this one. And basically, you get a line that your consent document does not comport with what the IRB requires.
Yes, use those templates. It is not plagiarism for you to use those templates. Um, In-person research consent form is just a little bit longer. I think for online surveys, we try to abridge it, but it consists of many of the same components. Um, some of the key things here is that when crafting a consent form, really craft it at a sixth grade reading level, so make sure it's accessible for all your study participants. Um, Let them read through that consent form and then sit down with them and go through each section verbally in plain English so that they have an understanding and they have a chance to ask questions. If they haven't asked any questions while you're going over it with them, make sure to give them a chance to ask questions before they sign. And then when they sign off, you're also signing off as an administrator and you're providing a copy for their records. Keep in mind that if you are dealing with participants who might have cognitive impairment or are all under 18, they might need an additional witness or someone else to sign off for them. Um, but those are extra considerations that I think are touched on within these templates. Um,
So let me just
yeah.
clarify. If you have someone that's cognitively impaired or a minor under whichever state you're conducting the research in, it requires a parental permission or a waiver. If often 17-year-olds, for instance, you may request a waiver from the IRB for an assent, and they consent. But the assent process is you get permission from a parent or guardian, or if they're a ward of the state or something, from that representative. They give them permission, but the individual also has the right to choose. And so that is an assent process. So you would actually, in that case, have two documents: that parental permission, for instance, and then the assent for the individual that is under the age of majority.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, and then there's also examples for these as well. Like Julia mentioned, there's a bunch of templates online. Find them and use them. So that brings us to the next part of this section, which is just briefly touching on data ethics. As you are, regardless if you're finding data that someone else collected and you're reusing it or you're collecting your own data, data ethics is something that you need to consider for both of these instances. Um, so the first thing I wanted to touch on is privacy. So is the information you are collecting something someone might reasonably be expecting to be private? It's always a good question to ask. Uh, if you're doing observation, a lot of the times if people are conducting themselves a certain way in public, they can reasonably expect to be observed. So if you're not interacting with them, then, it's probably okay. However, there's some caveats to that, right? If they might be engaging in activities that they don't expect to be observed, maybe it's unethical to conduct those observations. Posting publicly on social media is one that's gotten a lot of attention because is it ethical to collect that information? Uh, a lot of the times you can if you're not putting any non-public information to supplement that, and if you're disposing of identifiers. However, that is something to keep in mind. Like if someone is putting things online and they're putting it in like a support group, they might not reasonably be expecting to be observed in that instance. And so really consider whether or not what you're doing is ethical in terms of privacy, especially when things get a little bit fuzzy because there aren't very rigid rules about what is allowed in that sphere. Um, I also wanted to talk a little bit about de-identification. Um, the best way to de-identify your data is through the safe harbor method. That is a standard that requires the removal of 18 personal identifiers, that ensures that data can't be traced back to one person. You might not have all 18 identifiers, but it does list all of them. These things include like name, geographic location that's smaller than a state or smaller than 20,000 people within one area, any sort of dates, any personal numbers of information, so like phone numbers or email addresses or IP address, and biometrics. So if you are sharing your data set, even if it's with your collaborators, you do want to make sure that you're de-identifying that data set before you send it out. Especially if your collaborators are at a different institution, like you really consider like in terms of risk of of trying to find who these people are, that you're really minimizing that risk. And the best way to minimize that risk is de-identifying the data set. And especially if you're sharing your data publicly through like a data repository, you really want to um, de-identify it or aggregate it as much as you can.
The other thing too that I want to just briefly mention, the size of your targeted population also needs
Mhm.
because if it's small enough, then there's the potential just for the makeup of the group to identify an individual.
Yes, exactly. And some studies you may find, even if you've de-identified, by combining two variables, you can actually re-identify that population. That just deals with maybe very small populations, like Julia was saying, or they're very niche. Like if you were looking at women in the prison system, of which the population is very small, uh, even if you did a lot of de-identification, you might still be able to pinpoint that person. So if those are data sets that you want to make public, a lot of the times there's repositories that um, have controlled access set up where it's not publicly available to everyone. Like you need to submit an application of a research proposal and get vetted before you have access to that data within a controlled environment. So also something to keep in mind.
Can I mention, since you mentioned prisoners, the other
Sure.
thing too, when you're doing research with prisoners, one, most prisoner protocols come to a full committee. We have a representative too on campus that would also attend those meetings as more advocates for prisoners to make sure their rights are protected. It's difficult, if not impossible, to maintain confidentiality and privacy within the prison system because the very nature, generally to do research, you have to have permission from the warden so that individual knows. Often the guards know. And if prisoners are being pulled out of a group or something to participate in research, then often other prisoners know. So when you talk about confidentiality and privacy, the IRB wants to understand, I mean, we understand that there's that issue because of the nature of prisoners in that are in a confined facility. We also want to know how you as a researcher will protect confidentiality and privacy once you collect that data.
Yeah, that's a great differentiation of those two things because they are slightly different there. The other thing that I want you to consider is your sample in general. So your methodology, what decisions did you make about how your data was collected? If you're collecting your own data or if you're reusing someone else's data, what decisions did they make? Can you can you figure out if their methodology was sound, if their exclusion criteria was reasonable, or if something needs to be supplemented? Like if you're looking at different racial groups within a sample, do you have enough representation in order to conduct your study if you're reusing someone's data, or do you need to supplement that with another data source? Um, the other thing I want to talk about beyond just looking at your methodology is representation. Um, who is the data set representative of the general population, and do the variables need to be weighted in order to better reflect distribution? Who are you excluding from your sample? This is going beyond just, oh, these are our exclusion criteria. So we're excluding, for example, everyone who has psychosis. This is more subtle than that. For example, a study that relies on internet survey or Amazon's Mechanical Turk excludes participants who might not have access to the internet, such as those living in poverty, the houseless, and the elderly. So if those are your targets, you might see them less within your sample, and you might have to think of other strategies in order to make it more representative in that case. And then what generalizations can be made? Is your sample large enough to make those generalizations, or is it really small and you can't really generalize it to the population?
The
And
other thing to consider when you talk about that representation, it cannot be something because it's convenient for you. For instance, we get studies sometimes that they want to exclude someone from the greater Kalamazoo area because of parking and access to the university. And that's not, that may be an issue from the standpoint that somebody wants to participate, but parking is an issue. you make it clear in your consent document when you talk about the cost that they would be responsible for parking or however that works out. But you can't just exclude them because it's convenient for you that if they're on campus, you give those individuals the opportunity. And if they self-select and decide, no, I don't want to participate because of X, that's their choice. You can't just pick one particular gender unless it's tied directly to your research. It has to be equitable. And, we've had studies where maybe they're placing a sensor somewhere on the chest and they don't want to have females. They only want males because it's a comfort level. Then that's not a justification. We then would suggest that you recruit someone to your team that would be comfortable in that and make sure that there's safety measures in place because of that. So just keep in mind that when you have inclusion and exclusion, you have to be able to justify that. And again, it can't be because it's convenient for the researchers.
Yeah. And the other thing that's convenient to the researcher is collection. And I just kind of want you to think about some of these things as you're developing your study is are all the data you are collecting necessary? I think there's a tendency now that more is better. Maybe we'll collect it just in case, we want to examine other questions. You really should be collecting data that is just answering your question. You're creating hypotheses and you're only collecting what's needed. If the data points don't apply to the problem at hand, collecting is unnecessary and can be unethical if the data is sensitive, like if you're asking someone to disclose something that is sensitive information. So really consider what data you need for your analysis and limit the personal information you collect on your research subjects to just the information that you need. Um, Another thing to keep in mind when you're collecting is how you're asking people to report things. For example, gender, if you're just doing a binary, male and female, that might not apply to everyone. You're really doing a write-in, which might be more work for you, can give you more accurate results. Same thing with ethnicity and race. If you're allowing people to write in categories to self-identify, that is the better option because it is more representative of how people identify themselves. And also provide the opportunities to skip questions that participants don't want to answer. Research is something that's voluntary, and so make sure that, beyond the consent form saying, do you want to participate, which is a required question, most of the questions should be voluntary. Can't force the participant to do anything. Did I miss anything, Julia?
Well, if you're going to require an individual to answer all the questions, you have to say that right up front in the consent documents. If you agree to participate, you must do X. Because then it allows that individual to opt out. The other thing too, if they come to a question and they don't want to answer it and you've required, then they can leave the study. They can withdraw. They do not have to give you a reason. And if they don't offer a reason, you cannot ask them why. They have a right to just end their participation, and you can decide, or you can come back to the IRB as far as collected when that individual decides to leave a study, whether or not you can use it.
Okay, thank you, Julia. And that brings us to the end of those two sections. I'm going to pause for a second because we've been talking a lot. Are there any questions that anyone has? And it's okay if you don't have questions or if you want to leave them till the end. That's also fine. Okay. Well, in the interest of time, then I'm just going to keep going. I wanted to talk a little bit about data management because one of the components of having a successful research study is really thinking about what you're doing with your research data during the active and the inactive phase after you're done with it. So data management is how you structure, organize, and care for your data. I say that data management is a kindness to yourself and to others because doing a good job taking care of your data means that your future self can have the context and access to reuse your data, even if it's been years, um, and you've forgotten the project details. I'm just going to be briefly talking about the different components of data management. I've done full workshops on this. This is just a summary to kind of get you thinking about these. So the main components, the way that I think of it is you have file naming, so where your files are, knowing where they are without wasting time. Documentation, which is preparing for reuse and giving context to your data. Backup, which is ensuring access and making sure that you don't lose your data. Sharing, which is receiving recognition, advancing research, and long-term preservation, which is just maintaining access. We'll talk a little bit about what your obligations are as a researcher for how long to maintain your data after the study is closed. This is part of it. So just file naming, there are a few best practices to keep in mind. Make sure when you're coming up with a file structure that it's distinguishable from another project. If you lose track of it, that it makes sense to you, it's easily understood, and there's subfolders to categorize things if needed. Um, Describe a logic behind file naming to make sure things are consistent. So if you want to create a controlled vocabulary, if you want to say this is how we're going to name all these files to make them easier to find, that's a good place to get started. And consider what naming practices you want to include as a general rule. Avoid spaces, avoid special characters, write your date in a consistent manner. Consider whether you need specific software to access things. Here's an example of a file naming system that someone has used for their lab, where it really spells out how these files will be named. And so it's much easier to find something if everything is consistent. For documentation, that's just enough information about the project, methods, and materials, such as the information is maintained over time in an accessible format and valuable to those who need it. So for documentation, what you want to consider is what are disciplinary standards? So like does your discipline use a metadata schema or does it just use a README file? Are there any things that you should be putting together in a specific manner that others in your discipline can go in and reuse? Are you using a software that is proprietary? So do you need specific software access to get back into that data or to reuse it? Um, is if you've put documentation, if you've attached it to a file, is it easy to extract it and create documentation for all your files? Or if you've put it into a piece of software like Microsoft Access, how easy is it to take away all that information if you want to move it somewhere else? And do you have enough information so that you can take your project and be like, okay, I understand the decisions that have been made. I can pick this up in a year when it's no longer fresh in your mind. So here are two examples of documentation. A README file, which is a low barrier to access and it's pretty easy and fast to assemble, but it could be irregular. And then you have something like a metadata schema, which is a high barrier, so it takes a little bit of skill, but it is very standardized and very detailed. So it's something to consider, but always make sure that you're documenting, even if you start in the middle of your project, it's better than not doing any documentation. I'm also want to talk a little bit about file storage. Uh, for digital files, the rule is 3-2-1. Try to have 3 copies of an important file on 2 different media types, at least one in the cloud. These are just good practices so that if you're dealing with information that you don't lose it. Whether or not you follow it, certain projects might break some of these rules, but thinking about backup and what happens if you lose access to the data, like because your files get corrupted or your computer gets stolen or you misplace your flash drive, like what happens then? How much time do you need? and energy in order to recreate those files. Can they be recreated at all? And in addition to storage, I will strongly encourage you to consider versioning. Versioning can be done through OneDrive or Google Drive on campus automatically, or you can version manually by including a number at the end of your file. So instead of saving over the same file location, you create a new file each time. Okay. Paper file considerations. So if you are collecting your research and you're putting into a file cabinet, if you're giving surveys to individuals, make sure that you're keeping all that research data in locked offices and cabinets where participant files are kept, and you're limiting access to those who are actually on the protocol. So when you're submitting your proposal, you will list who is on your study. Those are the people who can have access to your files. And if there are other people in your office, make sure that you're keeping things locked so they don't have access if they're not on the protocol. Make sure you're keeping files in their entirety organized in the same place so it's not all over the place and you're having a hard time finding it. And consider creating a digital tracking spreadsheet. This might be helpful for you if there's multiple pieces you're keeping track of, just to make sure that do you have all the components? Are everything signed? Did you collect all the forms? Did you collect all the surveys from that individual? And make sure if
So,
you, yeah, go ahead, Julia.
I was going to say, I just want to mention a couple of things as far as human subject research is concerned in the WMU IRB. The storage that Daria mentioned pretty much covers it. But if you have data stored on your laptop must be encrypted.
Mhm.
If you lose that laptop, you must report it to research compliance immediately. And if you have a laptop that more than one person, more than anyone on the team has access to, we need to know that, and we need to know how you are securing the files that only your research team has access to it. Should your files be corrupted and you want to recover them, before you reach out to anyone, you need to notify the IRB. We need to know who, what agreements are in place, how that data, if they can recover it, may be accessed and used. So all of those things the IRB needs to understand. And from an IRB's perspective, while the data is collected, we need to know how it's being collected and how it's being held secure. If you're doing a field study or something off-site, we want to know when you're on site, how that data is collected and held secure. When it's transferred back to the university, we need to know that. And we need to know how that's happening. What we don't want to happen is you're doing a study in Battle Creek, you're collecting paper copies of something, and you leave it on your front seat and you decide I need to run into a store. That's not acceptable. It should be locked in your trunk. We need to understand that whole process so that no one other than the research team has access. Once the study is closed, not completed, but closed, then it must be kept EMU in a secure location. That may be a digital file locked in the principal investigator's office in a secure cabinet, or paper files. But keep in mind that research data and files includes everything. Your consents, your protocols, your data collection sheets. And if it's on a digital, then we need to know what that's going to look like. If you have videos, we want to know, are you transcribing and then deleting? All of that is something that the IRB looks at, and you need to consider all of the different mechanisms that you're going to use to collect data and how that data is going to be stored. Because if you don't include it, of course, we're going to send you a request for it.
Yeah, and regardless if you're collecting things on a paper or digitally, having a regulatory binder, which is a non-digital collection of all your important study documents, procedures, and summary, is a very good thing to have on hand. As Julia can tell you, the IRB sometimes does audits as if people are in compliance or not in compliance, or just to check if everything is as it should be. And these are essential for the IRB officer who comes by and does the audit to really have a good understanding of what's going on in the study, what has been done, what point you're in, and are you following these procedures. Um, it is also a great piece of documentation for someone in your lab, like if you have a new person who comes onto the protocol for them to read through and to understand what's happening.
Right. We want to make sure that, well, let me back up a second. We always audit for cause, and we are required by regulations to do so many post-approval monitoring audits. And those are generally random. You know, I will ask someone in the office, pick a number, and that's, you know, we look at the protocols accordingly. What I do not want is if I do an audit and you show up in my office with a box full of papers that look like you scooped them off a desk, then we'll have another discussion. But it wouldn't be the first time that someone's brought their files in that way, because then it lends itself to, if you're so disorganized in the documents that are essential for your study, then I sometimes wonder how well you've documented or collected the data, because that disorganization sometimes can get you in trouble.
Yeah. And here is just you can find information on how to put together a regulatory binder. Um, Probably there's multiple sources online. You can also contact me or Julia if you have any questions about that, but here's just a basic outline of things that you should be keeping in your regulatory binder. It's literally just if you need to assume that whoever's coming to look at your study does not have access to your computer and that these are the documents that they need. And they can see what you're doing based on this binder. So these are some of the categories you can be following when you're putting this together. Okay, and in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving unless someone has any questions. And I see that there's been a link posted for helpful tips on how to measure sex and gender in research. Yes, go ahead, check that out. Okay, the last section is data dissemination and preservation. It's just generally long-term storage and sharing. You might be collecting something that has a shorter shelf life than you think, depending on how you decide to collect that data. Like if you're using something that's on a CD-ROM that can degrade, or if you are using proprietary software and you lose access to that software and you can't get access to the data. Um, the point is that if you're conducting human subjects research at the university, you're required to keep all of your data for 3 years after the study closes, and you should be trying to put your data into a format that is accessible over at least that time period. So if you're using proprietary files, putting them into open source formats to make it accessible and to make sure that everything is findable and connected and stored in one place, like Julia was talking about earlier. In terms of post-study data retention, like we mentioned, 3 years, that's the WMU policy that it requires that all study files, and that's the complete study files that Julia was talking about, the consent forms, your summaries, all your surveys that you're collecting, all of that is retained for 3 years after the study closes. This may depend on your study, so some grants require variable retention. I know pediatric studies are particularly long, and if the study it becomes investigated, then you need to retain for 7 years after closure. Um, so retaining all the paper and electronic files in a secure locked location and keeping the electronic files on the WM server or encrypted when possible, And if you're a student and you want to move somewhere else and you want to take your data, making sure you're only taking the de-identified data set and that there is a copy that's being retained with the primary investigator. The primary investigator should always retain access of that data. You as a student should not be taking all that data with you. Did I miss anything, Julia?
Well, I was just, when students leave, if because at Western, even if it's for your dissertation thesis, honors, the PI is a WMU faculty or staff. It is important when you're conducting research to have some sort of agreement. I know that many do not require that, but I always suggest, because the PI may think that they have, and let's say it's your dissertation, the PI may think that they have certain rights to that data. And I think that it's in your best interest and good practice to have an agreement about how that data can be used. Because if it's for your dissertation, that's your research, you're required to do that research, and that data set should be yours. From our standpoint, you take a de-identified data set. The concern is that PI, most do not, but that PI may feel that they have certain rights to that data. And there's been a couple of occasions where it's come up, and I've always suggested that you have that discussion with the PI, and if you need something in writing, then you should get that. The other thing too, because an Excel spreadsheet was mentioned earlier, when you collect, let's say, survey data, you can put it in an Excel spreadsheet for convenience in analysis, but you still have to keep that survey. You cannot transfer the data into an Excel spreadsheet and then get rid of your digital or your paper surveys. You must keep that data, the original data that was collected, in the manner in which it was collected. So if you use Qualtrics, for instance, you would download it to a external drive of some sort, or you could keep it on a WMU server that the PI, if you're leaving WMU, that the PI at least would still have access to. And then, are we done? Okay, so the other thing, it's important not to scare you, but so that you realize that if you conduct human subject research and it requires IRB oversight, and you do not get IRB oversight before you start recruiting or collecting, that data disappears, because human subject research data must have IRB review and approval before you implement any aspect of your study. In addition, you can't go back to those same subjects and recollect that data. They're shut off because you've already reached out to them. And that, as I said, that data disappears. Technically, you're not even to discuss it in a casual conversation. It's as if that data has never existed. And then you get to meet me on the dark side, because
Don't meet Julia on the dark side.
now I'm going to look for potential research misconduct and noncompliance. Now, just so you're aware, we haven't had too many issues. ORI, who does provide oversight for research misconduct, does not conduct queries for students. We turn that over to student affairs, and we assist them in any manner that we can. So there's, if you have questions about whether or not your project requires IRB oversight, please reach out. Again, send me a brief summary. And if you're going to do an interview or a survey, send me your questions, I'll take a look at it, and if it requires IRB oversight, I will give you next steps. And anytime you have questions with regards to research and research compliance in particular, please reach out. We are a resource for you, and if we don't have the answer, I used to say I'd make it up, but instead we will point you to a resource so that you can get your research out of your head and out into the field.
Yeah. And we're out of time, so I won't go into too deeply into the next slides. The idea is, whoa, this is interesting animation. Data set curation has to do with when you're depositing, there's a list of questions to keep in mind. You'll have access to them with the slides. And then when you're looking for repositories to deposit into, here are some questions about those. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So thank you for your time. We are both here as resources for you. Julia said if you have any questions, you can reach out to her. I'm also available if you have questions about data management or where to deposit things. So reach out to either one of us and we'll make sure you're talking to the right person or have the right resources. So before you go, I'm going to share the slides. You'll also get an email if you had registered for this workshop. So here's a link to the slides for your reference. The recording will be available on the YouTube website, library YouTube website, so keep an eye on that or email me and I will send it to you. And I'm going to also send a link to Qualtrics forum if you want to share your impressions about this workshop. So thank you so much, and we'll take any questions that you have.
So the PowerPoint will be